So, welcome. I'm glad everyone is here tonight. To be mentioned, RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. And we are joined tonight by Olga Fedorenko. Olga Fedorenko is a professor of anthropology at Seoul National University. She received her PhD from the East Asian Studies Department at the University of Toronto and taught at New York University before joining SNU. A scholar of Korean studies and anthropology of media, Dr. Fedorenko has published on South Korean advertising and celebrity culture. Her new research explores Korean socialities and resurgence of analog media in post-digital South Korea. So tonight she will speak on the cultural environment of South Korean advertising professionals. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. So please welcome Dr. Fedorenko.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your introduction, Matt. So thank you for having me for, wow, 1,527. Okay, that's a scary number to think about. I have attended several of Royal Asiatic Society lectures in the past, so it is quite meaningful to be invited to talk about my work. So thanks to organizers. And also big thanks to those of you who showed up today. The weather is kind of miserable, so going outside an extra time is, kind of burdensome. Okay, so let me get straight to my topic since we, kind of have to be precise about the time. So first, I will offer you an anthropological perspective on Korean advertising as a social institution and its local specificities. And then I will talk about Korean advertising creatives to give a bit of a behind the scenes of how advertising works. This presentation is based on my book, Flower of Capitalism, South Korean Advertising at the Crossroads, which came out in 2022. There, I'm talking about contests around South Korean advertising in the first decade of the 21st century. So to do that work, I spent 14 months in 2009, 2010, doing what we call in anthropology, multi-sited fieldwork. So I worked as an intern at an advertising agency. I sat on the meetings of an advertising censorship board, the Korea Communication Standard Commission, 방송통신심의위원회. I also followed many advertising controversies, interviewed professionals and regular people about their opinions on advertising. I also partied at the advertising festival in Busan with movers and shakers of the advertising world. So on the one hand, I am theorizing advertising as a local social institution, not a global industry or universal medium. I'm also arguing against scholarship that automatically reduces advertising to its marketing functions, because advertising does much more than sell commodities, especially in South Korea, as I'm hoping to convince you. On the other hand, the book is also about South Korean democracy and capitalism, because at the time, like when I was doing my research, advertising became a focal point in contests over expanding corporate freedoms in economic and public spheres. So let me set up these points with a story of an advertising campaign from 2009, which some of you might even remember. So can we?
Wow. Wow.
So in summer 2009, KT ran a campaign to launch home telecommunications package. At the time, KT suffered a reputation of an obsolete, clunky, government-associated corporation. This campaign was to create a fresh image for leadership and technology and entertainment.
KT's advertising agency, Samsung affiliated Chair Communications, created a series of 9 animated ads for television and the internet. Each of the 9 ads followed the same comical plot. So a protagonist encounters a positive event and exclaims, wow, only to encounter even more positive event and then yell ole, and that's kind of the slogan of the campaign. Yeah, so here's like a storyboard from another one. So overall, this campaign was very popular. This exclamation ole made it to television programs, everyday conversations. Many netizens reposted ole on their blogs. That's time before social media. Parodies, imitations kind of appeared. Public opinion poll found this to be the second most memorable campaign of the year in 2009. So overall, very positive reception. But the ads were also criticized as belittling women and eroding family values. So the Golden Eggs, you saw the animation, and this one, Summer Camp, was also another problematic one. Next slide, please. The quasi-government okay, perfect, thank you. The quasi-government media watchdog, the Korea Communication Standards Commission, received complaints about the campaign. But it ruled that the campaign was just humorous, and those who were offended by it were too sensitive. Complaints about KT Ole ads were also received by influential feminist non-government organization Yoson Minoe, like Women Link is their official English name. But Yosong Minohe hesitated to interfere, and I quote Ms. Na, an articulate Korea activist in her 30s at the time, whom I interviewed as this controversy was unfolding. So she said, at our organization, we thought that there was a problem with this campaign, but we also thought, don't we need to recognize the freedom of expression even in advertising these days? Even though we thought there was a problem, we had no intention to interfere ourselves. Your question, don't we need to recognize the freedom of expression even in advertising, was an allusion to constitutional court decision, which just ruled for the, oops. I don't know what's happening there. Okay, this is good, yeah. Which just ruled for the first time in 2008 that advertising was included in constitutional guarantees of freedom of expression. The decision was a culmination of the big business lobby pushing for deregulation of advertising in mass media. So before that constitutional court decision, advertising was considered marketing communication, not protected speech. Every single commercial on national terrestrial channels had to pass pre-clearance by a quasi-government committee before it could be aired. But in August 2008, the Constitutional Court found this practice to be unconstitutional censorship. So after that decision, no centralized body pre-cleared advertising. The critics of the KT Ole campaign said that it would not have passed the old review system and lamented new lax standards. The regular audience members were unconcerned about advertisers' freedoms and kept complaining. Many Yosong Minohe supporters, for example, called their office demanding, often angrily, that the feminists do something about the campaign, as Ms. Na recalled. So after about a month of this, Women Link publicly demanded that KT stop the campaign. KT responded that that was unfeasible, but promised to consider Women Link's critics in the future. In response, Women Link went on the national television, MBC, to announce a boycott of KT until the advertising campaign is stopped. There is no information about how many people participated in the boycott, but a week after its announcement, KT withdrew the ads. The story had a continuation. In about 6 months, KT ran a new advertising campaign, which seemingly incorporated feminist critics. So the campaign's theme was challenging outdated norms under the slogan, turn the usual way upside down. The The campaign episodes mocked the usual ways, such as that all middle-aged women have the same perm for hairstyle, and that office workers order the same cheapest dish, jjajangmyeon, when the boss is treating. Significantly, one of the ads promoted women's equality by ridiculing the patriarchal norm that only women cook for the traditional holidays, such as Lunar New Year. So that's the one I have on the screen. Similar to the first campaign, KT ads assumed a fun, entertaining tone, but the critical message and the call to change discriminatory traditions practically acknowledge the demands by Women Link and other critics who wanted advertising to promote progressive values. So KT controversy reveals some of the typical contests over advertising and related dilemmas in post-millennial Korea. At their core, there is a tension between advertising being a private medium, in a sense being paid for by advertisers to advance their interests, but also advertising being a public medium, in a sense of its public circulation and its purported influence on social norms. Also, the controversy illustrates how trajectories of advertising campaigns are not controlled by advertisers, but are shaped by contingencies and general public. And this general public, importantly, exceeds target consumers and includes anyone exposed to the ad and inclined to react to it, including by complaining to authorities of NGOs. Finally, this controversy illustrates what Korean advertising often is, opportunistic and entertaining, but it also illustrates what Korean advertising is wanted to be by many, a medium for positive social interventions that creatively promotes desirable values such as gender equality. And importantly, that there are cultural and institutional resources to impose such a vision on advertising and advertisers. So my book, Flower of Capitalism, South Korean Advertising at the Crossroads, is a multi-sided ethnography of those conflicting claims from audience members, advertisers, NGOs, regulatory institutions, but also advertising makers and mass media, claims on advertising and visions for advertising in South Korea. So those are my guiding questions for this research. The first set deals with how advertising in its concrete local configurations is shaped by macro and micro struggles among advertisers, public, media, governments, and other actors. So what is the social contract that governs advertising, and when and how is it negotiated? Specifically for South Korean advertising, and that's the second set of questions, I explored how advertising ended up drawn into the realm of democratic accountability to a degree unimaginable in many other late capitalist countries, and how it ended up in an unlikely domain where the expansion of corporate freedoms met opposition. So through advertising, I'm also drawing out political, economic, and cultural struggles over Korean democracy and capitalism in the first decade of the millennium. I'm framing the study as a critical anthropology of advertising. Critical because my starting point are Marxist approaches, which elucidate how advertising is deployed for capitalist accumulation and reproduction. I particularly emphasize the political economic effects of commercial media depending on advertising revenues, so that big advertisers end up shaping media content and ultimately confining public debate to the pro-big business perspectives. The anthropology part comes in to account for how these structural forces are refracted through local contexts and reshaped by a local history of advertising and in general. Also to show that social actors' agendas do not neatly map in their vested interests. So, for example, left-wing progressive feminists of Yosong Minuhe might temporarily suspend feminist progressive agenda to respect the right-wing value of freedom to advertise under certain circumstances, as with the Katie Ole case. So Anthropological commitments led me to challenge the universalism associated with advertising. So what I mean is that there is a certain fascination with cultural differences as revealed in advertising texts. Like what's culturally appropriate in one place might be controversial in another. So that's kind of easy. But overall, there is a tendency to universalize a particular notion of advertising as a social institution, to basically assume that historical advertising structures, which originally developed like in North America and Western Europe, that they are kind of reproduced everywhere else, even though the circumstances under which advertising developed were quite different. In South Korea, for example, modern advertising developed not out of a need to sell mass-produced commodities, like unlike United States. Instead, in South Korea, modern advertising was championed by local eccentrics drawn to it as a sign of modernity. Also, technology was available and people thought like, okay, we can do advertising, why not? They have it in the United States. So kind of very different history of it. Early on, it was difficult to convince Korean companies to advertise. Many of them treated advertising as a ritualistic expense, like you kind of have to do it around Christmas, but that's about it. Yeah, so my point is that how advertising became integrated into South Korean life was not an inevitable, automatic consequence of its commercial functions, nor was it a mere emulation of how the advertising industry developed in the United States. Rather, it was something worked out over time in response to local needs and local struggles, with considerable cultural debate and with historical contingencies playing a role too. So I capture local notions and expectations of advertising as cultural logic of advertising. So I'm using cultural logic in very anthropological sense as this normative, common sense ideal about how something should be. So cultural logic is agreed upon in theory, but then it is negotiated, compromised in practical situations. To avoid possible misunderstandings, the origins of this cultural logic are not some mysterious innate cultural traits, but rather concrete historical events. So cultural logic is an outcome of local struggles within advertising industry among advertisers, governments, consumers, mass media. Yeah, so basically to emphasize, this is like a historical explanation. I can go into detail during Q&A. I have a whole chapter about that in the book, but for the talk, I'm kind of sticking to contemporary stuff. I'm bringing up cultural logic to distinguish it from advertising's capitalist logic, which is the usual focus of scholarship on advertising. The capitalist logic of advertising dictates that advertising, first of all, sells commodities and advances the material interests of advertisers. Cultural logic does not erase the commercial purposes of advertising, but rather it creates additional expectations, which might coincide or run counter to the capitalist logic. So what I discovered is that the cultural logic of South Korean advertising downplayed the marketing purposes of advertising and privileged advertising's potential for public service, both with advertising messages and advertising revenues. In public discourse in Korea, the commercial functions of advertising are often subordinated to public interests, like 공공의 이익 or 공익, which is generally understood as the interest of middle-class consumer and ironically often contrasted to the interests of big companies like the advertisers. These orientations were often expressed via the cliched metaphor for advertising, flower of capitalism, 광고, 자본주의 꽃이라는 광고. So that metaphor comes with positive connotations in Korean, and it very frequently appears in articles about advertising, and it's common to use floral patterns to decorate publications on advertising. The typical rhetorical work of this metaphor is to remind the audience of flowery public interest potential of advertising, either to praise advertising for living up to that ideal or criticize certain campaigns for not living up to that. So basically, the flower of capitalism metaphor expresses that cultural logic that I was introducing. Having said that, on the surface, the mainstream of South Korean advertising carries few traces of those public commitments. The majority of South Korean advertising at the time of my fieldwork and now, pretty much like mostly formulaic campaigns that announce the advertised commodity, include a celebrity to testify to its prestige. So my point is, cultural logics are ideals. They are not lived in every single situation. They have to be considered to practical situations' immediate interests. Where cultural logic visibly manifests was in public praise for advertising campaigns which relied on sentimental aesthetic and promoted wholesome values, such as human dignity, filial love, compassion, and so on. And there was a fair share of such campaigns, primarily from big companies. One of my extended examples in the second half of the lecture will be that. So cultural logic also manifests in unusually restrictive advertising policies, such as tight advertising regulation, legal obstacles to unmediated dealings between advertisers and terrestrial broadcasters, and restrictions on in-program advertising. So by putting flower of capitalism in the title of the book, I deployed this flower of capitalism metaphor both literally and critically. I wanted to foreground the link between advertising and capitalism, something that is actually frequently lost in the discussions of advertising in Korea. At the same time, I hope that the strangeness of this metaphor in English helps denaturalize the habitual assumptions about advertising and unearth critical openings which are barred when advertising as a social institution is just reduced to its commercial ends. So in the book, I develop a set of arguments about how advertising is a contested local social institution shaped by the interplay of capitalist, cultural, and situational logics. This, so in the book, I have like one historical chapter which explains how this logic came to be, and four ethnographic chapters which explain how it plays out in different contexts, like with advertising producers, audiences, censors, and activists. So for this talk, I will be pulling data mostly from two chapters on audiences and creatives, but of course, I'm happy to talk about other groups as well. So for the observers of Korean advertising, the funny, provocative, and offensive Ole ads were a challenge to the habitual advertising aesthetic adopted by big Korean corporations since at least 1980s. Typically, such advertising hardly ever mentions commodities or consumption. In that regard, Katie Ole campaign was quite typical, but unlike that campaign, usually such advertising circulates feel-good messages heavy on sentimentalism. So textbook example of this is a 1984 Toshirak ad. This has been like repeatedly praised as the most representative ad of Korean advertising. It is for a Sanyong group and it came out on Teacher's Day. Very simple visually, the long text tells a story about remembering a teacher who pretended that his stomach was unwell to give away his lunch to a hungry student. Can you guess from this ad what Sanyong Group did? I doubt it, because basically it was a typical chaebol, which at the time dabbled in oil refinery, cars, cement manufacturing, construction, financial services. Nothing related to food or education. So kind of like just sentimental campaign to convey a message. At the time of my fieldwork, such aesthetic was epitomized by Toward People, 사람을 향합니다, series by SK Telecom. And I would really like to show one ad from this campaign.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be.
That man, by the man.
Let it be. Let it be. Let it be. Let it be. There will be an answer. Let it be.
우리는 모두 누군가의 영웅입니다.
You all are a hero.
사람을 향합니다.
So basically, super sentimental story about ordinary people and the beauty of their ordinary lives, and simple but heavily effective audio visuals. Oops. Yeah, this aesthetic doesn't have a fixed name. It has been described as humanist advertising, corporate public service advertising, sentimental advertising, simply kind advertising, like Chakan Kwango. Sentimentalism of such ads is interpreted as an expression of native humanism. So such ads are often referred as Korean style Hangukdeogin Kwango. So I have collections of such ads on the YouTube channel I created for that. So like, yeah, maybe we could share it through Kakao Talk. So what's interesting about these ads, for scholars of advertising at least, is that they remain advertising only in their form, but lose content that could count as marketing communication for most practical purposes. They don't show commodities, they don't show scenes of consumption, they forget about the advertiser, maybe show the name at the very end. Instead, they talk about values, humanism, beauty of everyday life. Tellingly, one of the common praises for such advertising is that it is not advertising like Kwango Seroptian and Kwango, like unlikely advertising. Also unlikely are reactions to such ads. A typical response to such campaign is to savor the sentimental pleasures that the ad delivers. So let me quote from one low-profile blog about that hero commercial that you saw. When I saw this ad, I choked with emotions. We are all a hero for someone. This copy tremendously touched my heart. It is just images of what everyone likely had experienced in the everyday, accompanied by one-word labels, but it became an ad with which we all could identify, with which we all could feel deeply in our hearts. I remember how I would come up to TV because I heard the background music of this commercial when doing other things. And this is not a cherry-picked example. I've seen numerous enthusiastic, appreciative blog entries about this campaign and about many others like this. So early in my research, I was kind of incredulous about such praises. I found this sentimentality of these ads like a little saccharine, like over the top. Yeah, so my impulse was to dismiss the praises on the internet as likely paid for by the advertiser. But their sheer volume and their seemingly random occurrences in blogs, which were neither particularly popular nor talked about advertising, basically kind of refuted that suspicion. My attempts to solicit critical or ironic comments on such advertising in interviews and conversations also failed. Many of my Korean informants, however, seem to find puzzling my resistance to such campaigns' heartwarming aesthetic. So if for me, the instrumental medium advertising was kind of cheapening the message, for them, the sentimental message was saving the medium, kind of redeeming advertising. So an anthropological argument I'm making about this is that there is no natural way to respond to advertising. Some of its features, such as its marketing goals, might encourage certain modes of engagement, like certain distance, but advertising recipients, like other media audiences, interpret advertisements in context of reception and basically factor in their ideas about the medium itself. One of my discoveries was that the repertoire of culturally appropriate responses to advertising in Korea includes and even favors emotional identification. That's kind of my translation of konggam. So advertising's commercial purposes are basically irrelevant for its sentimental value. And the quote kind of illustrates this point. And to emphasize, this appreciation for humanist advertising might seem to be basically people indoctrinated by advertising, but actually that's not true. There is little empirical evidence that appreciation for advertising reliably translates into consumption. In a way, these advertising consumers process advertising as popular culture and often ignore the commercial message. In my interviews with regular people, I would often ask for examples of memorable advertising campaigns. Everyone would have one and would describe it in detail, but about half would not remember what the campaign was for. And many would be unsure whether it was a commercial advertising or public service announcement. So my more fundamental point here is that advertising is better understood, at least for scholars like myself, and at least in South Korea, as expressing social ideas. So people who wax lyrical about moving advertising campaigns buy into those ideals that advertising shows. So humanist capitalism, caring corporations, like in the case of the ads I show. This belief in the ideals does not necessarily translate into consumption of commodities, and even occasionally informs activism to criticize corporations for failing to live up to the image of themselves they created in their advertising. Just as advertising audiences do not necessarily buy into the consumerist messaging of advertising, Korean advertising professionals do not necessarily see themselves as in the business of selling commodities. In the final section of my talk, I would like to introduce aspirations and realities of people who make advertising in South Korea. As a part of my research, I was an intern and a participant observer at a major advertising agency in Seoul. In addition to helping my team develop concepts for several advertising campaigns, I was also interviewing anyone at the agency who seemed approachable. I also collected media interviews with celebrity advertising creatives to basically get a sense how they represent their occupation. So I wanted to know what kind of advertising makers themselves want to make, and to read their discourses against the participant observation data I was gathering. So I was surprised to find out that advertising producers were among the most taken in by the vision of advertising as committed to public service. Many of them, particularly those of the younger generation, got into advertising because they subscribed to the idealistic vision of it as a medium which could advance public good in clever, creative ways. Such, for example, was my key informant at the agency, whom in the book I'm calling Director Yu Pujanim. When we met in 2009, he was in his late 30s and had worked in advertising for about a decade. He reserved to become an admin in the early 90s after he, at the time, first-year English literature major, incidentally watched a collection of commercials which won international awards. Then and there, he decided that producing mesmerizing advertising ads like that is what he wanted to do with his life. He got an advertising job right after graduation, and that kind of story of a sudden recognition of a calling was actually quite typical for advertising people of his generation. And I heard several versions of that in my interviews. It was common for ad men and women to frame their relationship to advertising as obsession and addiction, and proudly so. So Yu Pujanim, Director Yu, he did just that. As an example, he told me that whenever he traveled abroad, he would try to visit famous advertising agencies to get a glimpse of how foreign creatives work. He sneaked in an office of a Paris branch of one international agency and almost got arrested for trespassing, but he kind of really wanted to see that. So he might be a bit on the extreme end, but generally not quite that unusual. So interestingly, rather than producing docile consumers, advertising in South Korea was producing fanatic producers of advertising. So what is it that makes advertising so attractive, that draws people to advertising work, that makes them self-professed advertising addicts? One answer I can offer is local understanding of what advertising work actually is. That comes off clearly in public discourse produced by local celebrity advertising creatives and for basically general public and fellow ad people. One of the most admired ad men in Korea is creative director behind the Hero commercial, which you just saw, Park Gun-hyun of TBWA Korea. He has been one of the most celebrated ad men in Korea with a cult-like following among junior advertising makers. His life story was quite remarkable. He started in advertising in the 1980s and very reluctantly, only after failing to get a job as a journalist. He graduated from Korea University from newspaper and broadcasting department. And in the 1980s, advertising was unprestigious, even embarrassing occupation associated with hucksters. So at best, university graduates from unprestigious majors who had no other options would go there. During his first years in the job, Park frustrated his colleagues with deliberate ineptness. But he eventually made his peace with being an ad man after realizing that advertising too was media content. He reconceptualized advertising as a medium with potential for social impact. And in that regard, actually not that different from journalism, his dream job. He describes this epiphany in many interviews and in his autobiographical book, Advertising Through the Humanities. In the 1990s and 2000s, Park went on to produce campaigns which became the classics of Korean humanist advertising, which I was talking about earlier. So his signature is sentimental humanism. Rather than praising commodities, he foregrounded social issues and celebrated ordinary lives of ordinary people. His campaigns taught Koreans that age is just a number, championed gender equality, criticized derogatory stereotypes of middle-aged women, just to give a few examples. So I'm pretty sure Korean people in the audience would know his advertising. Let me unpack his advertising philosophy. In his book, he writes at one point, "My interest is never in winning the advertising festival prizes, but in communication with the masses, with Korean masses." Note that both possible incentives for making advertising that he considers, winning prizes and talking to people, have nothing to do with selling commodities. I'm pulling one quote here, but it is actually very representative of what Park says in his book and in his countless media interviews. For him, advertising is effectively socially engaged art. In his book, he presents it as a commonsensical thing that his ads strive towards public service messages to move and inspire people, and whenever possible, speak to social issues. Similar sentiments were common among regular advertising makers, as I observed during my internship at an advertising agency. Many of them would bring up Park Gun-hyun as their hero and role model and recommend that I read his book to understand Korean advertising. This orientation toward public service also manifested when I asked advertising makers about specific campaigns they liked most. Almost all of them brought up ads which they saw as engaging with social issues or helping the underdog. So Director Yu, who I mentioned, he talked about how he poured his heart into a campaign for rice snacks for one of the Korean conglomerates. He didn't care about the conglomerate's profits, but he saw it as his way to help Korean rice farmers whose economic struggles are notorious. So he wanted to make a campaign that would sell a lot of rice cakes so farmers sell more rice and live a little bit better. His other example of a personally meaningful campaign was for an ice cream franchise. He recalled how, for research purposes, he visited some of the shops. And after talking to owners, he realized that most of them were elderly, people who put all their retirement savings to buy a franchise license and run the shop. So, Yupojanim felt he had to try harder to come up with compelling advertising so that those shops do well and the franchisees can afford the living expenses and licenses. So basically that those old people don't lose their retirement savings. Predictably, advertiser companies are not always sympathetic with such a flagrant neglect for the commodity. Characteristically, the campaign that Park Geun-hye was proud of most actually failed to sell. It told the story of the candlelight vigils for two schoolgirls run over by a US tank north of Seoul in June 2002 to illustrate Adidas' slogan, "Impossible is nothing." So, well, predictably, Adidas refused to buy the commercial. This neither stopped Park Geun-hye from sharing the story in his book, nor netizens from circulating this ad online. And Adidas was criticized for being narrow-minded and not running this ad. In this case, Park Geun-hye's vision of advertising as a means of communication with the masses canceled out advertising function as a sales tool and transformed it into public commentary. So Park Geun-hye earned his celebrity status, so he is able to produce and usually sell ads that tell socially engaging stories. For regular advertising makers, in order to be able to keep their jobs, they often end up making banal commodity-centered, celebrity-centered advertising, and then blame advertisers' narrow-mindedness for the triviality of their campaigns. Yupojanim, for example, once showed me a thick folder, like this thick, of his rejected ideas, which he hoped to reuse for other campaign one day. Other advertising makers channeled their creativity into kind of making speculative campaigns for advertising competitions. So that's basically the answer in case you're wondering why the mainstream of Korean advertising is what it is. According to Korean advertising makers, it is the fault of parochial advertisers. To move toward conclusion, I would like to juxtapose two television series about advertising professionals from around the time of my research. The first one is Mad Men, American TV series about an American advertising agency in the 1960s New York, which I'm assuming some of you might have seen. The other one is Korean TV miniseries Ad Genius Itebek, about two advertising agencies in Seoul. So both shows offer captivating glimpses into the world of advertising, but how they present advertising could not be more different. Mad Men portrays advertising as a cynical profession that panders to human follies and with cleverness and style. The serious, suave protagonist, creative director Don Draper, pronounces, for example, advertising is based on one thing, happiness. And do you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of a road that screams with reassurance that whatever you're doing, it is okay. You are okay. So kind of very cynical perspective. In contrast, the ads and people celebrated in Korean Ad Genius Itebek articulate the vision of advertising as a medium with heavy public responsibilities. One of the characters declares after being mistreated by a client, "We are ad men. That grievance, that unfairness, pour it into that, sublimate it into that, and show it to the world." Why? Because it is the mission of an ad man. Throughout the series, the Korean series, the positive characters, including the protagonist, preach about how the job of an ad man is to tell the truth. This message is illustrated with a career of one of the favorite characters of the show, the protagonist's mentor, a talented ad man who had his career short-circuited because he blew a whistle on an unscrupulous client. So he ended up as a lowly neighborhood sign maker, but his amazing creative talent made any business whose sign he created just basically boom. What I wish to illustrate with this contrast of popular cultural productions is the drastically different ideas of what advertising is and what it should do, as well as drastically different legends of the creative. Glamorous, cool, cynical Don Draper of Mad Men and agitated, earnest, and truth-seeking Itebek. Okay, so to conclude this talk, my key point is that advertising may be a global industry, but how advertising fits into social reality is far from universal or self-evident. Ongoing local contests define and redefine what advertising says, who gets to control it, and where their control begins and ends. In South Korea, the demands for advertising to be more than a private commercial tool, but the means to pursue public interest, have been influential. In the past decade, some public interest safeguards have been weakened due to changes in the media ecology, online media becoming the preferred way to reach audiences, and generally South Korea's general shift towards further neoliberalization. Yet, civil society groups like Yosong Minuhue, Women's Link, and a surprising number of citizens continue to police advertising and mobilize against what they see as problematic advertising campaigns. The current battleground is actually outdoor advertising, it seems. Billboards and transportation ads still indiscriminately reach broad audiences in the era of algorithmically curated online bubbles, which eliminate exposure to opposing viewpoints. Some citizen groups have challenged the situation that only commercial advertisers can access those commercialized public spaces. They attempted to place advocacy ads on hot issues such as gender equality or Seoul commemorations. Those advocacy ads sparked controversy and ignited debates over conditions for accessing public space for individuals and corporations. And advertising is right in the middle of those debates. So the argument that advertising should serve public interest continues to resonate in Korea even today. Like those outdoor controversies are kind of the topic of my next project. So to conclude, even amidst deepening deregulation and neoliberalization, South Korea serves as a fascinating example of how advertising is not foreclosed as a purely commercial domain guided by private interests and largely inaccessible to public claims. Advertising in Korea is treated as an important part of public culture, as a site and means towards achieving a better society, however utopian the aesthetic and politics that motivate this project might be. Okay, thank you for your attention.
I really miss the days when all the different Seoul would take that full page ads in the newspaper. Samsung Group congratulated Turkey on its XYZ National Day. Several presidents, Nulu, Turkish president, Nulu, Turkish ambassador to Korea, Nulu. Then the next page would be different groups, same content, different pictures in the background, almost having nothing to do with anything about Turkey or Korea or that Seoul. And newspapers are really very weak. They are.
For my other project, I'm actually looking at newspaper advertising, like not English language ones, but it is kind of still surprising to me that, you know, some corporations still do this like full page ads, and yeah, but definitely the number has shrunk considerably. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, mostly not only South Korean advertising, but also all of the advertising around the world are against feminism. But I reckon that this trend will not be likely to disappear. And moreover, advertising companies make use of this sentiment and emotion of popular people. And how do you think about my opinion? And can you explain about this sentiment and emotion of advertising companies anthropologically?
So the question is that sexist advertising exists all over the world, not just in Korea.
Yes, and this trend will not disappear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I do think that the gender equality kind of sensibilities are quite developed now in many places in the world. So, you know, if something is offensive, people will complain, people will campaign, and basically it will create negative publicity for companies, and no one wants that. So I see that happening in Korea once in a while, like it's happening in other places. So it's kind of like this ongoing, I guess, shifting of public standard, what is considered acceptable, what's not. So.
But factually, I heard that use of antiism is one method of advertising.
Okay, I have to look into this. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for your tremendous lecture. I really learned a lot. Just a question, this is like capitalism. So the company or the big companies, when they spend money for the advertisement,
Mhm.
for like product advertisement, or as you mentioned, like kind advertisement, or image advertisement. But after that, do they have any statistical data comparison? Is it good for the advertisement for the market, or is it, you know, product advertisement is better, or those kind of image advertisement is better? Do they have any comparison for the data?
Well, definitely companies gather such data, but the thing is, it's like really difficult to measure such things precisely because, you know, you cannot like isolate an advertising as one factor because like many other things are happening, like competitors are also advertising. So for example, and especially with things like image advertising, you know, it's again, I guess like when it would be noticeable effect, it's like say some new product and people like, oh yeah, that Kitty oil package, that's kind of cool. It was actually a tease campaign at the beginning. So then perhaps you could measure that. But for most advertising, for most companies, in a way, it's kind of like ongoing investment into public image. And by public image, we mean like, well, popularity of products is one thing, but not necessarily the main thing. It's like the attraction of company to potential job seekers. So a company like Fosco, like, you know, they don't sell consumer products. They sell, you know, metal to companies, but they advertise a lot. And part of it is to kind of create this image, oh yeah, be careful environment. Part of it to kind of make the company look cool, so cool young people want to work there. Also, apparently it affects stock prices. So if company kind of stops advertising, maybe they're having financial difficulty. So it's kind of like many factors come together. So they kind of, I'm like, basically the answer is yes, that data is collected, but the data doesn't give like clear answers. Like, okay, yeah, this campaign was effective. We should do it like this.
And how they spend the money for the advertisement if they don't have a comparison data?
Well, again, that's actually kind of interesting conversation because from my research, people who work in marketing, advertising, they are actually much more comfortable with like, well, you know, yeah, a lot of money is spent on marketing, advertising. We don't know for sure if it does anything. And people who are outside, they kind of imagine as like, you know, precision brain surgery. Like we invested like this much money in this campaign and we'll sell this much product. So it's kind of uncertain. So generally there is some expectation, there is some hope, but fundamentally it's like much more art than science. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned you celebrate your cultures. Then could you please more detail explain about Korea's celebrate culture?
Celebrity
Celebrate. You meant the celebrate. Celebrate. SELEBRITY.
Okay, so celebrity culture. Well, okay, actually, I almost don't talk about celebrities in this book, but in my other research, I did work on those topics. I mean, with advertising, basically, it is kind of the safest formula. Let's get the biggest celebrity now, and they show our product, and everyone will like us, and they're going to be super effective campaign. So that's kind of safe solution. And from my research, people who make advertising, they kind of don't like it because that's boring. Everyone is doing that, but advertisers, they want it, they like it because it feels safe. It feels like, oh yeah, if we get like the biggest star promoting our, I don't know, soda or cookies, that definitely will sell it. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, how I would answer that. Okay.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. You mentioned that many it's advertising led by many Jaguar and conglomerates companies in Korea. My interpretation, they use advertise to change Korean people's bad image into the good image. Yeah, you mentioned that SK and the Postco, but in comparison to for example, Yuan Kimberly, they pour into many money to their CSR program, Brigangsan Project, very around 20 years. However, as you mentioned, that is advertising is very short period, pour into money to increase Korean people's good image. They, my interpretation, they use malicious or distantly use that advertising to change Korean people's mind. That is probably Korean people's interpretation. What do you think about my interpretation about they using the advertising to change Korean people's mind?
I mean, I would agree with that. It kind of reminds me, like I read an article by some communication scholars that kind of did quantitative research. Basically, whenever a corporation has some corporate scandal, like the CEO is being investigated or something, their advertising spending goes up. So basically, it's kind of response like, yeah, let's present ourselves as, humanist and kind and caring. So that's kind of, in a way, immediate way to show that, yeah, we are good, we care. So that's like one answer. The other aspect of it, which I didn't touch in the talk, but actually talk about in the book, like, I guess kind of the question of newspaper advertising, like newspapers are pretty powerful political bodies in Korea. And buying advertising in newspapers is a way to build relationships with those newspapers. Like placing an ad in Chosun, it's a political act. So whether it sells commodities or not, that's like almost secondary consideration. What's important, it creates a connection. Similarly, placing an ad in Hungary, that's also kind of a particular statement, which might be even risky for some companies to do. So all that kind of gets into politics pretty fast. And again, one thing that was surprising for me when I was doing this research is how transparent this is. And basically pretty much most Korean people who have like this little interest in media would be quite aware of this dynamic. So like, oh yeah, and this month Samsung is not advertising in Hungary, what's going on? So kind of those connections between politics and advertising are very strong and very transparent. Yeah. Sure.
So yeah, those advertisers have an influence, and they can use that influence to get us to not publish articles about them or publish negative articles about their enemies or things like that. The newspapers I have here, the ads in them are extremely expensive for print for a few hundred people to see. And then if you look online, where probably tens of thousands of people might see those ads, they're very cheap. So I'm particularly curious if you've looked at across different mediums, like you've obviously discussed TV and print media, but I'm curious if you've also looked at how advertising is growing online.
I haven't. So basically my research was 2009, 2010, and that was basically the last moment before internet advertising became the main thing.
Okay.
I mean, the internet advertising was around, but still like a big campaign would be like on television and the newspaper. So in a way, it's kind of very quickly became historical research. Yeah.
Okay. I think it hasn't changed much since then. I suspect that like online is just for reaching consumers, but the print ads are for reaching, media, other important companies and stuff like that. Like they look at the print newspapers, they don't look at lines or read about themselves and about each other. So, yeah, but I'd be very curious to learn more about how advertising has landed online, if it's totally reset all these standards or not. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a great idea for next project.
I might take it, but.
Yeah, okay. Yes, please.
Knowing what you know as an expert in cultural influence and advertising, if you were hypothetically placed as the person in charge of starting a new marketing campaign or advertisement campaign, say for an organization that started in 1900, what medium would you use? What pillars of emphasis? How would you go about it? I'll take that as a free consultation.
That's a tricky question.
Well, and her fee consulting is probably high.
Oh, that's why I asked you what that.
Well, maybe my answer would be like, I'm not good at such things. That's why I kind of became an anthropologist. Yeah, so like when I was intern at the advertising agency, there was this moment which kind of in some ways was, well, traumatic and interesting for me. So the team I was assigned for, we were working on a campaign for some chocolate cookie advertising. And the homework we got, like, okay, you have like 1 day, come up with something, and we have a meeting and everyone presents their ideas. And that was probably my like second week into internship, and I really wanted to be useful and really wanted to come up with something. So I tried, and it was kind of shocking how quickly I kind of went into like the most awful, banal cliches, like chocolate indulgence, chocolate. Yeah, so in a way, I did come up with some ideas. I thought they were horrible, but I kind of had to present something. And the whole experience, well, kind of made me realize, yeah, I should stick to academia, part of it. And second, it also kind of made me realize how difficult it is to say something interesting. I mean, the situation was like the chocolate cookie wasn't particularly good. So I kind of tasted it like, okay, whatever, I guess edible, but that's about it. So I didn't particularly like it. I didn't have anything particularly positive to say about it, but I have my co-workers who I'm kind of trying to impress. So that pressure is actually quite real. So yeah, that's basically kind of a long-winded answer that I would hire someone else to do it. Yeah.
And I agree to the previous question that arguably Korean advertising has been progressed consummatingly. So can you anticipate the trend of AI generation? So what's the trend? What will be the trend of advertising in South Korea in the AI generation?
That's really interesting question. I don't know, can advertising write humanistic copy? I mean, can AI write humanistic copy? I somehow think it should probably do quite well with that, because it is like, you know, have to mention warm feelings, show some children, you know, sentimental things. So yeah, I think that definitely would be competing for those jobs quite successfully.
There's questions. Okay.
Shall I, maybe why don't you read it? Or shall I read it, because I'll be facing.
Because, well, this will be at the video, so
Okay,
everyone can read it.
so the question is big turnaround from KT after feminist critique. So I did talk with people who actually made that campaign. So the question is about like that KT Ole follow-up, where it is kind of progressive messages. They wouldn't say that they were influenced by this. They said, yeah, that was pretty minor, that boycott, we kind of know about it. And the campaign was ended because it was supposed to end like at more or less that time anyway. So it kind of ran its course already. So from the perspective of people who worked on the campaign, at least from what they told me, that it was not really an influence, but kind of juxtaposing things. Here they have this criticism by feminist organization. Half a year later, here is our feminist ad. yeah, I don't know, to me, kind of circumstantial evidence points to that they probably listened, even though they would not acknowledge that directly. So, yeah, but that's kind of my speculation.
I think the advertisement, in a sense, reflects Korea's democratic development. In that sense, I think 2008 Constitutional Court ruling, which was to protect the expression, the right of expression in press, marked a turning point in a sense. A turning point. Before that time, I think the context of advertising has been regulated by the government, and for the protection of public interest to the sacrifice of private commercial. After the ruling of Korean Constitution for 2008, is there any, because expression of freedom of expression is not limited. It is, even though it is guaranteed by the Constitution, but there is limitation to the protection of freedom of expression in consideration of national security and public order, liberty. In this regard, is there any incident or case which was prohibited by the court?
Okay, interesting question. And like one thing, I will take it like an opportunity to kind of give a little bit of a historical context. So that 2008 decision to rule advertising protected speech, that was kind of in the making for a while, but like the really crucial moment when connects advertising and democracy is actually in 1974, like Donghaebo White Pages incident, like Chisafor. So basically, in case you're not familiar with that story, like a group of journalists from Donghaebo is protesting Park Chung-hee measures, and the pressure put on newspaper advertisers to pull their ads to force the newspaper to buy the journalists. So the newspaper is published with like white spaces where advertising used to be, and those white spaces kind of become a symbol of struggle for Korean democracy. So it starts like that, and then concerned citizens send like private, like Pyongyang Kwango, like kind of support ads to the newspaper to support it. And that whole thing becomes like this chapter in Korean democracy, and usually it's kind of narrated as a story of media struggle for democracy. In my book, I'm kind of reinterpreting it to say that, well, what was the medium here? Actually advertising. So advertising was that medium which allowed people to express support for struggle for democracy when journalists couldn't say it. But like those private ads published anonymously, they could do it. So kind of from that moment on, there is like this discussion that there is a obligation of commercial advertising to support democracy in Korea. And that kind of argument was actually quite strong and kind of continued in the 80s and on. So in a way, like that democracy advertising conversation in Korea has been unusually active. So that's like a little bit of a digression. After 2008, so advertising is protected speech, but as you said, in Korea, freedom of speech is not absolute. There is national security law, but there are also these regulations of advertising. Like, you know, you cannot advertise cigarettes to children. You cannot like use, I guess, Jocelyn's example, like folk songs in advertising. You cannot say something is number one. So that actually like this thick book of regulations, and usually like it has to comply with all those regulations. And if it doesn't happen, like it cannot work. So it's kind of like freedom, but freedom to a degree. Yeah. I guess our time is up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Please check our website for upcoming lectures and events.